was all over the place, just getting through lots of tissues and crying and crying. And then I thought, look, I've got to get a grip here and do something useful for Diana.
What if the world never knew the full truth about Princess Diana? Her brother, Charles Spencer, is finally revealing hidden details that challenge everything. From the funeral procession to the royal family's silence, his words expose the harsh reality of Diana's final days. Why was William and Harry's grief put on display? What was the palace hiding? And why is Spencer speaking out now? For decades, the world has heard countless retellings of Princess Diana's life and tragic death. The media painted their version. The royal family maintained their silence, and the public grieved a woman they felt was one of their own. But amidst all of this, one voice had remained largely unheard: her brother, Charles Spencer. His silence had never been about indifference. It was about pain, the weight of truth, and perhaps the consequences of speaking out. Now, he has finally broken that silence, and what he has revealed has left the world speechless. The shock of Diana's death on the early morning of the 31st of August, 1997, sent an earthquake of grief through Britain and beyond. In Paris, a black Mercedes carrying the Princess of Wales crashed in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel while trying to escape paparazzi on motorcycles. Within minutes, the news began to spread. At first, there were whispers of an accident, then headlines of serious injuries. But it wasn't long before the inevitable announcement came: Diana, the most beloved woman in Britain, had died from her injuries. The reaction was immediate. Within hours, thousands of people flooded the streets outside Kensington Palace. Flowers, candles, and handwritten letters covered the gates and pavements. Many stood in silence, their faces wet with tears, unable to comprehend the loss. Across the world, millions sat in front of their televisions, stunned. It wasn't just mourning, it was anger, disbelief, and an overwhelming sense that this should never have happened. People demanded answers. Why had Diana been left so vulnerable? Why was she being chased through the streets of Paris? And why had no one protected her? Far from the chaos unfolding in London, Charles Spencer was asleep in his home in South Africa. The phone rang in the middle of the night, piercing through the silence. Groggy and unaware of what awaited him, he answered. The voice on the other end was steady but cautious. Diana had been in a serious car accident. She was critically injured. There were no further details. Spencer sat up, his heart pounding. The words felt surreal. A car accident? He knew how the press followed her, how they chased her relentlessly. But could it really have ended like this? He waited, helpless, for another call. An hour later, the phone rang again. This time, the voice was different, colder, more final. "I'm sorry, sir. She didn't make it." The silence that followed was suffocating. Spencer sat motionless, trying to grasp the words he had just heard. His sister, the girl he had grown up with, the woman who had struggled against the weight of the institution she had married into, was gone. The grief came swiftly, but it was almost immediately swallowed by something else: rage. There was no doubt in his mind about who was responsible. The paparazzi. The photographers who had turned Diana's life into a never-ending chase had finally cornered her. Even as she lay in the wreckage of the crash, fighting for her last breaths, they had not stopped. Cameras flashed. The pursuit had never ended. But Spencer knew that while the press had played their part, the blame did not rest on them alone. The royal family had failed her. Diana had been divorced from Prince Charles for over a year, but she was still the mother of the future king. She was still one of the most famous women in the world. Why had she not been given the protection she needed? Why had she been left alone in a foreign country, chased by men on motorcycles, with no royal security? These were the thoughts that burned in Spencer's mind as he boarded a flight back to Britain. When he arrived in London, the atmosphere was unlike anything he had ever experienced. The grief was everywhere, raw and uncontained. People stood in groups, comforting strangers, lighting candles, clutching photographs of the princess they had adored. Yet amidst all this sorrow, there was something missing. The royal family was nowhere to be seen. The silence from the monarchy was growing louder by the hour. No statement, no presence, nothing. The public had expected a response, some form of acknowledgement, a word of condolence, anything. Instead, Buckingham Palace remained eerily quiet. The Queen, Prince Charles, and the rest of the royal family were at Balmoral in Scotland, completely out of view. It was as if they were refusing to acknowledge what had happened. The press, which had spent years tearing Diana apart, suddenly changed its tone. Now, the headlines turned against the monarchy. "Where is the Queen? Your people are mourning, why aren't you? Show us you care." The pressure was mounting, and it wasn't just coming from the public. The global media had joined in the scrutiny, demanding to know why the royal family had not yet spoken. For Spencer, the most pressing concern was not the public outcry, but the two young boys left behind. William, just 15 years old, and Harry, only 12, had been at Balmoral when the news was broken to them by their father. It was impossible to comprehend what that moment must have been like for them. William tried to process the unthinkable, while Harry, in his innocence, kept asking the same question over and over again. Is she really gone? In the days that followed, tensions only escalated. The royal family remained out of sight, as if untouched by the tragedy. 5 days passed before Queen Elizabeth finally addressed the nation. Standing before cameras, she spoke of Diana's warmth, her devotion to her children, and the tragedy of her passing. She called her an exceptional and gifted woman. But to many, the speech came too late. The damage had already been done. The public had seen the contrast between Diana's open love for the people and the monarchy's cold distance. The divide had never been clearer. Diana's funeral was set for the 6th of September. It was to be one of the largest public farewells in modern history, an event watched by billions. But as preparations began, Spencer was faced with something that made his grief even heavier. It had been decided that William and Harry would walk behind their mother's coffin. To the outside world, this seemed like a necessary tribute, a final, solemn farewell from her sons. But Spencer knew better. He understood what this meant. Two grieving children were being asked to march through the streets of London in front of flashing cameras, their every move analyzed, their every expression scrutinized. It was not just painful, it was cruel. Speaking with a Buckingham Palace courtier, he made his feelings clear. "Absolutely not," he said. "She would never have wanted this." But the response was cold and firm. "It has been decided." Spencer refused to accept it. He pushed back, argued, and demanded that the plan be reconsidered. He insisted that it was unnecessary, that it was an unbearable burden to place on two boys who had just lost their mother. Then he was told something that made him hesitate. "William and Harry want to do this." He paused. If this was truly their choice, then he would not stand in their way. If this was how they wanted to say goodbye, he would support them. But years later, the truth would come out. Harry revealed that they had never been given a choice. They had simply been told what to do. At 12 years old, Harry had no power to refuse. Spencer, who had believed he was honoring their wishes, later realized he had been misled. He had unknowingly stepped aside for something he would never have allowed had he known the truth. Now, as the day of the funeral approached, he understood that there was nothing left to do except walk beside them. The world would soon witness one of the most heartbreaking moments in modern history. The morning of September 6, 1997, was unlike any other. A silence hung over London, a kind of stillness that only came in moments of profound grief. The streets were lined with people, millions standing shoulder to shoulder, some clutching flowers, others holding photographs of the woman they had loved from a distance. Many had spent the night on the pavement, unwilling to miss this final farewell. It was a moment that transcended royal tradition, a funeral unlike any Britain had seen before. The world was watching, and what they saw was heartbreaking. At the center of it all were two young boys walking behind their mother's coffin. Prince William, just 15, and Prince Harry, only 12, took slow, measured steps as the crowd wept around them. They did not cry. They did not break down. They remained stoic, their eyes fixed ahead, as the weight of the world pressed down on them. To many, this image would come to define their childhood. The loss of their mother, played out in front of billions, would be a moment neither of them would ever forget. The sight of the young princes walking in the funeral procession was unbearable for Charles Spencer. He had fought against this decision, arguing that it was cruel and unnecessary, that no child should have to endure such a thing in front of the world's cameras. But he had been told otherwise. He had been assured that William and Harry had agreed to it, that they wanted to honor their mother in this way. He believed it then. Years later, he would learn the truth, that they had never been given a choice. As the procession moved through the streets of London, the sound of quiet sobs could be heard from the crowd. People reached out as the coffin passed, as if trying to touch a piece of history. The flowers that had been laid along the route were so thick in places that they covered the road entirely. The horses pulling the gun carriage stepped over them carefully, the scent of fresh roses and lilies lingering in the air. The weight of grief was almost suffocating. But inside Westminster Abbey, as the mourners took their seats, another moment was about to take place, one that no one saw coming. Charles Spencer had been asked to deliver a eulogy for his sister, and from the moment he stepped up to the lectern, the atmosphere shifted. His words were not just about Diana, they were about everything she had endured. He spoke of her kindness, her compassion, her love for her sons. But he did not stop there. He called her the most hunted person of the modern age, a woman whose life had been relentlessly scrutinized by the press. He did not hide his anger. He did not soften his words. He laid the blame at the feet of those who had exploited her, those who had failed to protect her. And then, in a moment that sent shockwaves through the room, he made a promise. He vowed that Diana's sons would be protected, that they would be cared for by their mother's blood family, not just the Windsors. The reaction inside Westminster Abbey was unprecedented. For a royal funeral, where tradition and decorum dictated every moment, no one expected what happened next. Applause. It started hesitantly, a few people clapping, before it spread through the congregation. It was an extraordinary breach of royal protocol, a spontaneous outpouring of agreement. Spencer's words had struck a nerve. The monarchy had been challenged inside its own sacred space, and the people responded. The Queen, seated with the rest of the royal family, remained emotionless. Prince Charles showed no reaction. But outside the Abbey, the words Spencer had spoken echoed through the streets of London and across television screens worldwide. People knew exactly what he had meant. He had not just eulogized his sister, he had sent a message. For the royal family, the implications of Spencer's speech were clear. His criticism of the press was expected. But his implication that the monarchy had also failed Diana, that her children needed to be protected from them, was something far more dangerous. It was a direct challenge to the institution, spoken at the most high-profile event the royal family had faced in decades. In the hours following the funeral, Spencer's words dominated the headlines. Some praised him for speaking the truth, for saying what so many had felt for years, but had never dared to say. Others accused him of deepening the divide, of making a painful day even more difficult for William and Harry. But for Spencer, there was no regret. He had lost his sister, and he was not going to let her memory be rewritten by those who had failed her. As the day ended and Diana was laid to rest, the world began to shift its focus. The funeral had been a moment of collective mourning, but now the attention turned to what came next. The royal family had survived this crisis, but the damage was done. The people had seen the contrast between Diana and the monarchy, between the warmth of the princess they had loved and the coldness of the institution she had once been part of. For William and Harry, the funeral was not just the end of their mother's life, it was the beginning of a new reality, one in which they would have to navigate grief in a world that never let them forget. For Spencer, his fight was far from over. He had spoken at his sister's funeral, but the battle for her legacy had only just begun. As the final prayers were spoken, and Diana was laid to rest on the small island at Althorpe, the Spencer family estate, the air of mourning remained thick over Britain. The world had watched as the funeral came to a close, but for Charles Spencer, the weight of grief did not end when the cameras stopped rolling. He had made a promise in front of millions that Diana's sons would be protected. It was a promise that would prove to be far more complicated than he had ever imagined. In the days following the funeral, Spencer found himself at the center of an uncomfortable reality. He had spoken boldly, making it clear that he believed Diana had been failed not just by the media, but by the institution she had once been part of. The words he had delivered at Westminster Abbey had sent ripples through the monarchy. But now, in the quiet aftermath, it was clear that they had also drawn a line between himself and the royal family. He was not a man who belonged to their world. He had no title beyond his inherited one, no place within the structure of the monarchy. He had been raised in aristocracy, but the power of the crown was something entirely different. And yet, his sister had been drawn into that world, and now her sons remained in it. Despite the applause his speech had received, despite the public support for his words, Spencer was beginning to realize that protecting William and Harry from the pressures that had once broken Diana was not going to be as simple as he had hoped. The boys returned to Balmoral after the funeral, once again secluded behind the stone walls of the royal estate in Scotland. While the rest of the world had been processing the loss through shared grief, they had been kept away from the public eye. Their days were filled with routine, an attempt to return to some form of normality. But it was no longer normal anymore. Their mother was gone, and the royal family was not a place where emotions were easily expressed. For Spencer, the struggle was knowing that there was nothing he could do to change their reality. His speech had been a declaration, a moment of defiance against the forces that had shaped Diana's fate. But William and Harry were still the sons of the future king. Their futures had already been written. The aftermath of Diana's death also brought an uncomfortable scrutiny onto Spencer himself. While much of the public praised him for speaking with honesty and passion, others questioned his motivations. Some accused him of using his sister's death to settle a personal score with the monarchy. The media, which had played such a central role in Diana's suffering, now turned its attention to her brother. His own past was examined, his decisions criticized. But none of it mattered to him as much as the thought of what Diana had endured. He could not shake the feeling that her death had been preventable, that if she had been given the protection she deserved, things could have been different. He had spoken out, but speaking out did not bring her back, and it did not stop what was coming next. As the months passed, the narrative around Diana's death began to shift. The royal family, once accused of coldness and indifference, began working to restore their public image. The Queen, whose delayed response had been widely criticized, took steps to reinforce the idea that Diana's legacy would be honored. Charitable initiatives were launched in her name. Prince Charles made more public appearances with William and Harry, presenting a united front of fatherhood and duty. But beneath the surface, the divide remained. Spencer knew that Diana had never truly been accepted by the monarchy. Even in death, her presence was something that unsettled them. She had not followed the rules. She had connected with the people in a way no royal had before. And her brother had made it clear that he was not going to let her be forgotten. In private conversations, he continued to express his frustration. He believed that Diana's treatment, both before and after her marriage ended, had been unfair. She had been isolated, left to navigate a world that had never truly embraced her. And now, in her absence, that same world was shaping the future of her children. But Spencer had no say in it. He could not dictate their lives. He had made a promise, but how could he fulfill it when the forces around William and Harry were so much larger than him? For the monarchy, the challenge was clear. Diana's death had forced them to confront an image problem unlike any they had faced before. They had survived crises, scandals, and political turmoil. But this was different. The grief of the people had been real, and it had been intertwined with resentment toward the very institution Diana had once been part of. In the years following her death, efforts were made to modernize the monarchy, to make it appear more in touch with the public. William and Harry became central figures in this effort. The two young princes, once seen as children too young to understand the weight of their loss, were now symbols of a monarchy that was evolving. But for Spencer, the reality remained unchanged. He had lost his sister. The world had lost Diana, the woman, the mother, the humanitarian. No amount of carefully managed public relations could change that. His words at Westminster Abbey had been a challenge, but challenges to the monarchy rarely resulted in change. The royal family continued, unshaken, just as it always had. But Diana's story was far from over. Her absence had left questions that would not go away. And the impact of her life and her death was only just beginning to unfold. As the months passed, the world adjusted to a new reality, one without Princess Diana. The outpouring of grief had been unlike anything seen before, and yet life moved forward. For the monarchy, the initial wave of backlash had started to fade. Public sentiment, once hostile, was slowly shifting. The Queen, after facing severe criticism for her delayed response, had begun making more public appearances. Prince Charles, who had struggled to manage his public image, was seen frequently with his sons, ensuring that they remained at the forefront of the royal narrative. But behind the carefully orchestrated displays of unity, tensions remained. For Charles Spencer, the months after Diana's funeral were filled with frustration. He had spoken with conviction at Westminster Abbey, but the reality of what followed made it clear that his words had done little to change the course of events. His nephews remained deeply embedded in the royal system, their futures controlled by the very institution he had subtly criticized in his eulogy. He had wanted them to be raised with a sense of normalcy, away from the rigid expectations that had once suffocated Diana. But that was never going to happen. They were heirs to the throne, and their destiny had already been decided. Despite the monarchy's attempts to repair its reputation, the cracks that had been exposed in the days following Diana's death were not easily forgotten. The public had seen a side of the royal family that had long been concealed behind tradition and protocol. For the first time, people had questioned whether the monarchy truly understood the people it was meant to serve. Diana had been the one royal who had bridged that gap, who had shown warmth and relatability. And now she is gone. The institution had survived the scandal, but it had not emerged unscathed. The royal family, known for its ability to control the narrative, was determined to shape the way Diana would be remembered. Charitable foundations were established in her name, highlighting her humanitarian work. Public statements were made about her legacy, her devotion to her children, and her role as a figure of compassion. But there was one thing they did not acknowledge: the struggles she had faced behind palace walls. The reality of her isolation, the emotional turmoil that had led her to speak out in her infamous interviews, was something the institution was eager to push aside. Spencer saw it for what it was. He knew that Diana's true story was far more complicated than the version being publicly promoted. He also knew that his role in shaping her legacy was limited. He was not part of the monarchy. He had no official voice in how history would remember his sister. He could speak in interviews, he could write about her, but ultimately, the royal family had the power to dictate how she was framed in the years to come. The strain between Spencer and the Windsors remained beneath the surface, unspoken but ever present. He had not directly accused them of wrongdoing in his eulogy, but the message had been clear. Diana had suffered, and the people responsible for protecting her had failed. That accusation, even unspoken, had left an invisible barrier between him and the family that still controlled the future of his nephews. For William and Harry, life moved forward under the watchful eyes of the public. They were expected to carry on, to represent stability, to ensure that the monarchy remained relevant in an evolving world. The weight of expectation that had once been placed on Diana now rested on them. But unlike their mother, they had no choice but to conform. Spencer had made a promise to protect them, but in the months that followed, he realized that promise was impossible to keep. The institution was too powerful, too deeply ingrained in their lives. He could offer them guidance, a connection to their mother's side of the family, but he could not change their fate. It was a painful realization, one that would stay with him for years to come. The monarchy had weathered the storm of Diana's death, but the questions surrounding her life and legacy had not disappeared. If anything, they had only grown louder. And as the years went by, those questions would take on new meaning, especially for the son who would one day decide to walk away from it all. Years passed, but the shadow of Diana's absence never faded. Her sons grew up under the watchful gaze of the public, their every move analyzed, their lives dissected in ways few could comprehend. The monarchy carried on, its traditions unchanged, its image carefully managed. But beneath the surface, the impact of her death continued to shape the royal family in ways that could not be ignored. For Charles Spencer, the passage of time did little to ease his frustration. He had watched as Diana's memory was polished and reshaped, as her struggles were slowly erased from the official narrative. The monarchy acknowledged her charitable work, her devotion to her children, and her warmth, but they did not speak of her pain. They did not address the battles she had fought within the institution, the ways she had suffered behind palace doors. Spencer remained outspoken about his sister's life, but there was only so much he could do. The power of the royal family extended beyond what most people could imagine. They dictated history in ways that few questioned, ensuring that Diana's legacy was remembered on their terms. There were moments when Spencer considered stepping away from it all, leaving the past where it was, but he could not. His loyalty to his sister ran too deep. He would not let her story be rewritten without resistance. Meanwhile, William and Harry continued to follow the paths laid out for them. The weight of their mother's legacy followed them everywhere, but they responded to it in different ways. William, the heir, understood his duty. He knew that one day he would take his father's place, and he embraced the role with quiet determination. He had always been the more reserved of the two, the one who carried himself with the composure expected of a future king. For him, there was no other option but to move forward within the system that had shaped his life. Harry, however, was different. From a young age, he had struggled with the expectations placed upon him. He was only 12 when he lost his mother, and as he grew older, the pain of that loss did not fade. The press, which had pursued Diana so ruthlessly, turned its attention to him. He saw the same cycle repeating, the same relentless scrutiny that had made his mother's life unbearable. Unlike William, he was not bound by the same destiny. He was not the heir. He was the spare. And that distinction gave him something his brother did not have: an escape. As the years went on, the divide between Harry and the royal family became more apparent. He spoke openly about his struggles, about the toll that life in the monarchy had taken on him. He sought to carve out his own identity, separate from the rigid expectations that had long defined his role. But it wasn't until he met Meghan Markle that the cracks in his relationship with the monarchy became impossible to ignore. Spencer saw the parallels immediately. Meghan, like Diana, was an outsider. She was welcomed at first, celebrated as a fresh new addition to the royal family. But it didn't take long for the narrative to shift. The same press that had once adored her turned against her. The headlines became brutal, the criticism relentless. Spencer recognized the pattern. It was the same pattern that had followed Diana, the same cycle of adoration followed by destruction. Harry had seen it too, and he refused to let history repeat itself. In 2020, he made the decision that would change everything. He and Meghan stepped down as senior members of the royal family, walking away from the institution that had shaped his entire life. It was a move that sent shockwaves through the monarchy, a direct rejection of the system that had always seemed untouchable. Spencer understood why Harry left. He knew the pain of watching someone he loved suffer under the weight of royal expectations. He had seen it with Diana, and now he was seeing it again. The difference was that Harry had a choice. He could leave. He could build a life outside of the monarchy, away from the traditions and constraints that had defined his mother's existence. And so he did. For the royal family, it was yet another crisis, another test of their ability to endure. They had survived Diana's death. They had weathered the public backlash that followed. But Harry's departure was different. It was not a tragedy imposed upon them. It was a choice, a deliberate public rejection of everything the monarchy stood for. Diana's influence had never faded, but now it was clearer than ever. Her son had walked away from the system she had once struggled against. He had chosen a different path, one she might have taken herself had she been given the chance. Spencer had fought for Diana's memory for years and had struggled against the rewriting of her story. But in the end, it was her own son who had made the most powerful statement of all. The monarchy remained, just as it always had, just as it always would. But Diana's legacy was not theirs to control. It lived on in the choices of those who refused to be bound by the past, in the son who had chosen freedom over tradition. And for Spencer, that was the one victory that truly mattered. With that, we have reached the end of today's video. If you have come this far with us, be sure to check out other videos on the channel.